Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, second year. How are you? I hope you will be fine. Today we will continue the reproduction, chapter number 20 and lecture number 2. After the completion of this lecture, you will be able to explain the structure and function of human female reproductive system, describe the menstrual cycle and role of hormones in female reproductive system. The reproductive role of female is far more complex than that of male. She not only has to produce gametes, but her body must be prepared to nurture a developing embryo for a period of approximately 9 months. Here we have the structure of reproductive system. Female reproductive system consists of gametes, a pair of ovaries. You can see here the pair of ovaries. Oviducts, these are the oviducts. Uterus, this is uterus, and vagina, the opening towards the outside. Ovaries, female gonads which produce ova and releases hormones. Paired ovaries flank the uterus on each side. These are the ovaries on each side of the uterus. Each ovary is held in the place within the peritoneal cavity by ligaments. These are the ovaries, ligaments. The ovaries are solid, ovoid structures, 3 to 5 centimeter long and 2 to 3 centimeters wide. Within ovaries, tiny sac-like structures, ovarian follicles are present. These are the follicles. Ovarian follicles consist of an immature egg called oocyte. One oocyte is ejected from ovary each month. This event is called ovulation. The ruptured follicle is transformed into glandular corpus luteum. Oviduct, fallopian tubes, uterine tube, initial part of female duct system, receive ovulated oocytes, site of fertilization, 10 centimeters long, transfer developing ovum from ovary towards uterus. Uterus, it is hollow, muscular, shaped somewhat like an inverted pear, has 3 portions: fundus, body, and cervix. Oviduct joins the uterus below the fundus. Opening of cervix leads to vaginal canal. Wall of the uterus is composed of perimetrium, myometrium, and endometrium. Perimetrium, myometrium, and endometrium. Vagina, thin-walled, 8 to 10 centimeter long tube, extends from the cervix to the body exterior. It is called birth canal. It provides a passageway for delivery of an infant and menstrual flow. Urethra is embedded in its anterior wall. Here is a table for the structures and function of female reproductive system. Ovary, site of storage and development of oocytes. Oviduct, duct for transporting oocyte from ovary to uterus, also site for fertilization if it occurs. Uterus, hollow chamber in which embryo develops. Cervix, lower part of the uterus that open into the vagina. Vagina, organ of sexual intercourse, produces lubricating fluid, also the birth canal. And clitoris, organ of sexual arousal.
produces female gametes or ova. In close relation to the ovary, oviduct is present. It is a funnel-shaped structure, usually with fimbricated margin. The end serves to pick up the ova liberated from the ovary. The proximal end of oviduct enters into the uterus. The uterus is a muscular bag. The wall of the uterus has 3 layers of tissue. The external thin membranous perimetrium, middle thick layer of smooth muscle, myometrium, and inner glandular layer called endometrium that lines the uterine cavity. The endometrium undergoes cyclical changes during menstrual cycle, while myometrium exhibits strong contraction during the delivery of the baby. Under proper hormonal stimulation, uterine endometrial wall gets modified for the implantation of the fertilized ovum and also form placenta and fetal membrane during intrauterine development of an embryo. Uterus opens into a long tube, the vagina, the opening being guarded by cervix of the uterus, a sphincter that prevents the entry of harmful bacteria and other substances inside it. Vagina serves to receive sperms after copulation. The accessory glands associated with the female reproductive tract are Bartholin's glands, opening by ducts at the external genital opening. Associated with the female reproductive system are mammary glands, their function being the nourishment of the young ones during prenatal life. The mammary glands are paired structures, breasts, that contain glandular tissue and variable amount of fat. The glandular tissue of each is divided into 15 to 20 mammary lobes containing clusters of cells called alveoli. The alveoli open in to mammary tubules. The tubules of each lobe join to form a mammary duct. Ducts join to form a wider mammary ampulla, which is connected to lactiferous duct through which milk is sucked out. The female external genitalia include mons pubis, labia majora, labia minora, hymen, and clitoris. The opening of vagina is partially covered by membrane called hymen. The clitoris is a tiny finger-like structure above the urethral opening.
Oogenesis, the process of egg formation in females, is called oogenesis. First of all, primary oocyte with diploid number of chromosomes, then first polar body is formed and secondary oocyte is formed, and that is the half number of chromosomes. Oogenesis, follicle development. Oogenesis by the formation of polar bodies in each step. First of all, this 2N oogonium is formed, and then primary oocyte is produced, which is 2N, and all that is before birth. With follicle development, you can see primordial follicle and again the primordial follicle. After childhood, the primary oocyte is produced, and with primary follicle, with growing follicle, and then the haploid secondary oocyte, first polar body, and now this is ready for fertilization, and secondary oocyte is in ovulation produced, and now this is capable of fertilization, and after fertilization 2N zygote is produced, and the corpus luteum is the remaining of follicle material. Female reproductive cycle. The sequence of all reproductive events in female reproductive system is called the female reproductive cycle or the menstrual cycle. It is divided into two phases, ovarian cycle and uterine cycle. Events of both cycles are well coordinated by pituitary hormones called the gonadotropins, and based upon changes and hormonal regulations, the cycle can be divided into three phases. You can see here the part of an ovary or the section of an ovary, blood vessels, primordial follicles, primary ova converts into primary follicle, then developing follicles, these are the developing follicles, then the mature Graphian follicle, a secondary ovum, then ruptured follicles, liberated ovum, and early corpus luteum remains of this ruptured follicle, and this is the corpus luteum and corpus albicans. These are the remains of follicles and after the liberation of this ovum. Here is another video for your understanding.
First section of ovum. Ovary contains large number of sac-like structures called as Graphian follicles or ovarian follicles. Graphian follicles has centrally located cell which is large called ovum. When ovum matures, the follicles ruptures and releases the ovum. The ruptured follicle is known as corpus luteum. Every time one follicle matures and releases one ovum into the body cavity, ovulation. As the follicle matures or ripens, it projects out from the ovarian surface as a small cyst-like oval swelling which bursts to liberate the ovum. This process is called as ovulation. Menstrual cycle. In young girls, Graphian follicles do not reach maturity. They begin to open only when puberty commences in the girl. Time for puberty in the female is 10 to 15 years. All changes undergone by a young girl during puberty are due to pituitary gonadotropins, which stimulates the ovaries. Ovaries, on stimulation, secrete some specific hormones, especially the estrogen and progesterone, which regulate the development of primary and secondary sex characters of female. Menstruation begins about 15 days after ovulation and lasts about 2 to 5 days. Under the influence of follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, an ovum and its follicle matures. This follicle secretes an increased amount of estrogen, which stimulates the regrowth of the endometrium. The increased production of estrogen triggers the production of LH, an example of the feedback. Paradoxically, at the end of the cycle, LH and FSH production declines as a result of the increased concentration of progesterone and estrogen. Menstrual cycle involves proliferative phase. Proliferative phase is also called as follicular phase or stage of repair. In this stage, proliferation repairing of endometrial lining takes place. Ovulatory phase. During this period, ovulation takes place and body temperature rises, which remains high until the onset of next menstrual period. Secretory phase. Secretory phase is under the control of progesterone and estrogen secreted in corpus luteum, also known as progravid phase, prepares endometrium for pregnancy and implantation. Destructive phase. Destructive phase is also called as stage of menstrual flow, which lasts for 3 to 5 days. During pregnancy, it does not retain the corpus luteum. It is replaced by scar tissue called as corpus albicans. menstrual cycle ceases around 50 years. That is termed as menopause. Cyclic menstruation is an indication of normal reproductive phase and extends between menarche and menopause.
G. This is another view of three phases of female reproductive system: ovarian cycle and menstruation, proliferative phase, secretory phase, and maturation phase. Here we have a table for the different hormones, endocrine glands, anterior pituitary and ovaries, and the names of hormones: FSH, LH, estrogen, and progesterone, and the functions of these hormones involved in the female reproductive system. FSH, it stimulates the follicular growth in ovaries, stimulates estrogen secretion. LH, uh, it causes ovulation and result in the formation of corpus luteum. Estrogen thickens the uterine lining and inhibit FSH and LH for most of cycle, and stimulates FSH and LH release pre-ovulation. Progesterone thickens uterine lining and inhibit FSH and LH. Here we have another video for your understanding.
Sexual maturity. Each of a woman's ovaries contains about 200,000 immature eggs called primary oocytes. A primary oocyte is diploid and is arrested in prophase 1 of meiosis. A layer of follicle cells surrounds each primary oocyte. Together, an oocyte and its follicle cells make up a follicle. An ovarian cycle lasts about 28 days, beginning at the first day of menstruation or menses. During the first 7 days of the cycle, 6 to 12 primary oocytes begin to mature. As the follicles develop, the follicle cells communicate with oocytes and pass them nutrients through pores called gap junctions. Each oocyte grows larger, and the surrounding follicle cells divide, proliferating to produce thousands of follicle cells in a single follicle. By day 7, all but one of the developing follicles begins to degenerate. The remaining follicle continues to develop, and its follicle cells continue to pump it with nourishment, and also supply it with proteins and informational molecules needed for early stages of development. The maturing primary oocyte completes meiosis 1 and divides into 2 haploid cells. Each of these cells receives half the chromosomes. However, one cell, called a polar body, receives very little cytoplasm. The other, now a secondary oocyte, enters meiosis 2 and rests there until fertilization. At day 14, ovulation occurs, and the secondary oocyte erupts from the ovary. The oviduct contains microscopic cilia that feed and draw in the released oocytes. This immature egg enters an oviduct, where it may become fertilized by a sperm cell and complete meiosis. The follicle cells that are left behind develop into a small mass of endocrine tissue called the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum remains in the ovary for 2 weeks, secreting the hormones estrogen and progesterone. At the end of the ovarian cycle, if the woman is not pregnant, the corpus luteum disintegrates. Each month, the ovarian cycle is tightly coordinated with the uterine cycle. In the uterine cycle, the lining of the uterus builds up and then sloughs off. The cycle begins with the sloughing of the uterine lining. This is the first day of menses, also called menstruation. After menstruation, the uterine lining starts to grow again and to prepare for implantation of an embryo. During this phase of the uterine cycle, up until ovulation, the uterine lining proliferates. Capillary beds supply this tissue with nutrients. Just before menstruation occurs again, the capillary beds degenerate and no longer deliver the surrounding tissue with nutrients. During menstruation, this tissue dies and sloughs off through the vagina to the outside of the body.
This was all about the female reproductive system, and I hope you will be able to understand the different structures and functions of the female reproductive system.